Stiegler calls such civic environments memnotechnical systems, or organized devices that mediate conscious time and space as lived, okay? So this term, memnotechnical system, refers to what Stiegler calls processes of grammatization, and we've been talking about different kinds of grammars, social grammars, over the last couple of days. He calls this processes of grammatization, the techniques through which memory is externalized, made discrete, and opened up to social collectivity. Here I'm suggesting that the city is a memnotechnical composition, one that creates the perceptual grammars composing settler environments. Alternatively, in repercussions, Calder treats the screened city as a composition exteriorizing indigenous civic grammars. And I'm going to spend the rest of my analysis mainly unpacking how I see this working, the exteriorizing of indigenous civic grammars. So the city scene in the film reflects both the colonial biopolitics of the state and the audiovisuality of contemporary life. A young woman walks out of Union Station, nationalist symbol, in the city as archive, into a self-reflexively screened milieu. This is important in at least two ways. Firstly, the woman seems unsure of her step as she's walking down the stairs and vulnerable in the darkness. Her appearance suggests both her identity as an indigenous woman and an unprivileged class location. Here, Calder conveys how cities compose through biopolitical structures that produce spaces, identities, and communities. What I mean here is that the effectiveness of this scene relies upon audience recognition of the woman's unprivileged or seemingly vulnerable situation, out of which flows an entire settler colonial biopolitics in the context of Canadian cities. And so, in my view, Calder has referenced all of this in the opening moments of the work as the woman is walking down the stairs of the train station. Secondly, the archival stock footage, self-reflexively prefacing the narrative, blurs boundaries between audiovisual and material spaces, privileging the role of industrial audiovisual medias in the grammatization of civic environments. And so while cities in Canada are co-constituted by the state form and capitalist markets, repercussions suggest that the aesthetic grammar of their politics has shifted into the domain of audiovisual medias, lending enactments through and with screens constitutive power in civic life. As Calder's figure moves out from the station, indigenous aesthetic traditions translate her experience. She walks down the station steps and a neon light flashes sound waves emerging from the ground, marking, literally, an audiovisual captivation. What flows from this seems at first like a kind of dangerous passivity in the figure's fidelity to forces that compel her attention. What I mean by this is that one doesn't think of lying on the sidewalk at night downtown as a particularly emancipated position initially. However, as she lies down with her ear against the sidewalk, twice she lifts her fist in the air and brings it down to pound the ground, bouncing her into another dimension. In this dimension, music blares. The chunk of a train has become the beat of the song Electric Powwow by the indigenous music group called A Tribe Called Red, which has recently come into popular and critical acclaim in Canada. A Tribe Called Red combines techno music and powwow, the latter of which is a North American indigenous dance tradition, as well as a practice of translocal collectivity and spiritual cosmology for indigenous peoples in North America. DJ Bear Witness of A Tribe Called Red has suggested that his music creates a kind of indigenous meeting place or space in cities. And similarly, Calder's film conveys how audiovisual translations of traditions can make an indigenous environment in cities, both individually and communally. In this environment, the young woman witnesses two scenes. First, a woman with a baby strapped to her back in skins with beautiful beadwork design and a basket of berries is sitting in front of her. This is obviously another space-time from the one on the sidewalk. When she lands back on the sidewalk, the station door opens and light pours down from above. A figure emerges from the building and its sleeve bears the insignia of the Toronto Police. The police officer looks down from the top of the stairs as the young woman raises her fist again and hits the ground. For me, this is a really tense moment. This is the moment of this short that I feel the most anxiety. Then, the word cuts to the second vision, in which silhouettes and regalia are located underneath Roman arches, birch trees in the background, beating their drums to the beat of the song. As they fade in the foreground, the woman from the first vision is imaged dancing. Lastly, while behind silhouettes are running, the face of the woman is shown looking seriously and commandingly at the viewer. Back on the sidewalk, the police officer is revealed to be the woman from the vision. Her bead earring presents a spot of color in the deep blue tones of the street side with which her uniform blends perfectly. And this point I think is really interesting. I was just telling Ian before we started that Terrell does every still individually, which you don't actually have to do when you make a film, even with marionette puppets, but she's just that way, I guess. And so what you end up having is really beautiful stills, and really precise stills. And I wish that I could get the still for you, or for us, but when the police officer goes to lay down, the bead earring is the only break in the uniformity of the frame. Okay? And in itself, I feel like this frame visualizes how indigenous aesthetics create an epistemic break in what seems to be a uniformly settler environment. It sort of visualizes this. And it also connects to what you were talking about yesterday, Lynn, about Rancière. I think that this film really relates to some of that discussion because Rancière calls the distribution of the sensible the police, right? And then aesthetics is a break in that distribution of the sensible. That's what he thinks politics is. And as well, he considers that aesthetic break an enunciation of equality. And when the policewoman and the young women lie down on the ground together, I feel like this is an enunciation of equality, a priori equality before their positionalities in the city that we see initially. So, okay, an epistemic break in what seems to be a uniformly settler environment. In this vein, I think of the cliched connotations of phrases associated with the Woman's Act, and these are all English idioms, but I hope we can follow. Hitting the pavement, associated with being kicked to the curb, perhaps, or pounding the pavement to look for means or support. All of these connotations suggest an undesirable position. Working against these cliches, Calder deconstructs civic scripts around indigeneity through their explicit staging. Folded into an indigenous space and time, they are recast as evolving states of freedom, okay, which is sort of contrary to the way we normally think of this scene. And here I want to return to the notion of captivation for a moment. For cultural studies critic Ray Chow, captivation is the deranged remainder that is unassimilable to the meta-narratives of freedom undergirded by liberal understandings of subjectivity, okay? The deranged remainder. I can't help but feel that in Calder's film, subjectivity is emphatically not understood in liberal terms. And I also feel that her character's state of captivation as a site of emancipation is a part of that reframing of agency, if you will. It seems to me that in Calder's film, her character's captivation by a spiritual realm conveys indigenous intergenerational pedagogy, centering the face of a baby in the ending whose eyes emit a technological and otherworldly light. These transmissions of captivation as psychic circuits between figures and viewers creates a self-reflexively communal narrative that relationally codes the time and space of the city as an indigenous audiovisual archive. In my view, the question of transnational literacies emerges here in relation to decolonizing civic grammars and centering indigenous genealogies of the city. In Canada, and I'm following Diana Bryden a little bit here, I understand the aesthetic formation of nation-state as accruing through the co-emergence of, quote, traditions of political thought and literary language, particularly the realist Bildungsroman or novel of development emerging out of Europe. And we talked a little bit yesterday about the persistence of these humanist visions of personhood in the present that flow out of this period when the nation-state was forming. So against these perceptual grammars, Repercussions treats the supposed settler origins of the civic archive and the ways in which its law, founded in this origin, discomposes relationally with the resurgence of indigeneity. Calder's figures wordlessly transmit their captivations or spiritual visions to one another. I see this as staging a pedagogical method of indigenous narrative form by emphasizing meanings in a collective space, conscious immersion in narrative spaces, and denying authorial ownership over knowledge. These methods convey fundamental aspects of indigenous narrative while decolonizing biopolitical and industrial audiovisual grammars in order to move away from the epistemic foreclosures of settler coloniality. These decolonizing uses of audiovisual medias are in line with photographer and filmmaker Helen Grace's reconfiguring of the logic of image capture. Oh, that's not what I need, this. Rather than reality being contained, detained, or retained in the copy image, understood as repository, it is now the machinic act or event of capture with its capacity for further partitioning, that is, for generating additional copies and images ad infinitum, that sets reality in motion, that invents or makes reality as it were. What is at stake then in contemporary audiovisual production is, quote, the collapse of the time lag between the world and its capture. The capture produces rather than preserves. In this sense, audiovisual capture can be related to new memnotechnical identifications and indigenous community formation, as well as the role of aesthetic captivation in producing the same. Mohawk artist and critic Stephen Loft asserts that, quote, for Native peoples, justice resides chiefly in the right to self-determination, an assertion of who we are as a people. Colonial realities and their unfolding in Canadian cities may appear to stymie this assertion, but this depends upon the way in which these constructions are framed. Repercussions advances a framework that troubles the stable construction of civic memory and advances the city, not given from the past, but made and remade in the present as a future yet to be determined. As Métis scholar Bonita Lawrence writes of urban Native peoples, indigeneity refers less to colonial modes of existence and identity than to a future post-colonial refashioning of indigenous identities, truer to indigenous histories and cultures than those identities shaped by the colonial realities that continue to surround Native peoples at present. Lawrence writes that colonial identities and realities have a grammar that must be ruptured. Calder's creative contention configures translocal Native citizenship through practices of relating to environments. The Roman arches of the train station combine with the living reality of cosmological forces, mnemonics, and emanating music as the ground on which it stands. This is, of course, the scene that captivates its central figure in a state, according to what I'll call settler colonial understandings, which reads as self-destructive passivity, lying on the sidewalk. And so again, articulating agencies apart from those recognized by the settler formation, Calder grounds civic ethics in indigenous domains of power and reframing imaginings of justice. So in conclusion, repercussion stages a perceptual reality with its audiences, merging indigenous traditions and technologies to disrupt the social ontology of existent civic grammar. In this way, she uses audiovisual medias not to valorize an original identity, nor to present a hermeneutic depth model that would be a sort of Bildungsroman experience for the viewer. Okay, I compose myself as knower by knowing you. Nor to present a liberal framing of agency, but to negate these grammars of neoliberal settler nationhood. As settler colonial critic Elizabeth Povinelli points out, liberal, national, and transnational hermeneutics work as a technology of distribution that, for Dene scholar Glenn Coulthard, reproduce the configurations of colonial power that indigenous assertions challenge. Okay, I have a block quote from Ray Chow on this point, okay, against these distributions and configurations, which is that Calder's staging is not so much with the aim of finding or relocating the past, but for assembling or compositing the past in the form of a contemporary artifact, replete with libidinal, machinic, and historical bits and pieces, as outlined here. The emergence of such artifactual installations, together with the inexhaustible webs of discourse that unfold and circulate around them, is likely to define the terms for a new visibility of indigeneity in Canada. And I'm not talking only about contemporary art, because obviously that's a little obscure. I wish it were less obscure. But I'm also talking about the way that these sort of stagings also accrue in the domains of social media, around social movements like I Don't Know More, which is an indigenous resistance movement that's, accumulated a lot of momentum in Canada over the last year that has relied strongly on social media. And so this sort of machinic composition and visual culture is beyond the domain of contemporary arts and also in civil society broadly. In these ways, she articulates self-determined conditions of perception with her audience, resurging indigenous epistemologies of civic space, and composing a transnational civic archive in Canada.